On the podcast, we're going to speak about the benefits of leaving society, the path of a hermit, why people on the spiritual path become a recluse, and just the general benefits of, escaping the general mundane world and the rigors of daily life that most of us are caught in, right? Like work, repeat, work, home, repeat, this kind of process. And, if you're interested in Eastern philosophy, then you would obviously know that the path of a hermit or like a sage in the mountains is kind of part and parcel of a lot of the traditions. We have the yogis in India, the sadhus in India. We have Lao-tzu who left, if you take the story of Lao-tzu literally, who left at the Western Gate to head west, and he was completely done with all of the Confucian morality and, all of the posturing in society that we see. And so he left. And we also know of that the Taoist monk that time up in the mountains in China, who was kind of like asked about like, don't you miss your family and this and that? And he was kind of speaking in terms that his family was kind of like an impediment to his own spiritual progress. And he was like, all good that they're doing their thing. I'm up here doing my thing now, and I'm going to spend the rest of my days up on the mountain here. And a lot of people get like really sensitive about that. We should like stay and play our part in society, and we have all of these like ridiculous notions, and a lot of them are Western notions. But as we see in the East, it was always, those people were always venerated, like the vanaprasthas. Once they had done their duties in society, they were kind of honored for leaving and doing the spiritual work, right? So, and that's what. I think a lot of people don't understand, especially in the modern day and in the West, because, we're supposed to, apparently be part of society and play our part, but it in some sense impedes our spiritual progress. And it's something that a lot of us don't talk about. And you and I, we recently came back from our own personal retreat and gave us a lot of things to reflect upon, especially upon that, because you get in this habit of, doing things, right? So you're constantly doing, and then it's not just the doing, it's like the mind gets in this process of thinking about what's the next thing to do and what's that I have to do in the future. And we all constantly get in this habit, and that's a result of being in this kind of society that is we could say yang dependent, right? So you're constantly active, which gets your mind in that process of doing.
Yeah, definitely. Like you mentioned earlier, in old days, in ancient traditional cultures, they honor those people who want to walk on the path of spiritual practice and want to be isolated and become a hermit or whatnot. And that was very respected. But nowadays, the world became too complex and too large. And as time went by, our culture kind of became very materialistic, and we need to, work hard and make a big bank account to pursue that kind of goal, and that became much more valuable than walking the path of spirituality, right? That's why when you say something like you want to become, hermit or be in isolation to pursue your own spiritual practice, then you pretty much be laughed at, right? Unfortunately, because that's not very valued nowadays, which is very sad and disappointing.
Well, again, it's just that tendency people have to defend society, like as if society is like giving them something, as if society is something that we should defend, even though society itself is destroying our nature. The reason why a lot of the great spiritual masters why they left society is because they understood that their nature was being destroyed. Now, there's a story in the Zhuangzi, and it's called it's a story of Hundun, and it's one of the famous stories. It's actually the last story in the inner chapters. It's the seventh story. So, and ironically, the story is about. So there's the northern sea and the southern sea. And then there's Hundun in the center, right? And you can think of Hundun in the sense here as like the kind of like the Greek chaos, that kind of that idea in Greek philosophy. And Hundun is like, Hundun has no holes in his face. So this is kind of representative of this wholeness that one has intrinsically before society touches you, right? And so there's a few ways to take this story. Like I'm giving you kind of a general sort of an overview of the Hundun. You know, we're not going to unpack it here. But it's really about this idea of identity. Now, this idea that what happens is that in the stories, the northern and southern oceans, which we could say could be representatives of Confucianism, come to Hundun, and they always go to Hundun to seek advice and this and that, and Hundun always has the way to, you know, show the way forward, because it is the essence of the, you know, the world, basically. And so to thank Hundun after giving advice, they said we need to, everyone has 7 holes in their face, like, you know, to experience the world, and so forth and so on. So they drill 7 holes in his face, and then that destroys Hundun, kills him. So it's metaphorical. There's a lot of things about this story that we could unpack, but the idea is that because they cultivated him with these 7 holes, which is kind of representative of giving him Confucian morality, that destroyed his pure nature, right? And so that sort of understanding is why we have the Taoist sage, why Zhuangzi's story is poignant, Lao-tzu's story is poignant, why the Yoga Sutras are poignant, you know, why the Buddha left the kingdom, you know. So we have all of that. And so that's one of the main reasons to get out of the societies, because you're trying to dissociate with this identity you've been given, right? Like society has given you. Like Guyang is like this. She's brought up in this culture. She should think like this, even though you don't. You know, and so that's a result of them drilling the 7 holes in your face, so to speak. You know. So
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I think identity became a big thing for some reason to a lot of people, and most people. They need to know their identity. They need to have their identity, right? And without identity, they feel, I don't know, being nothing, or they not being valued by other people in society, and that threatens people. So that you need to have an identity, so that you need to get in a certain type of group where you identify as the same as the other people who are in the group, right? That could be just in a, I don't know, it could be the country, it could be race, it could be religious thing, or it can be just a friends or family, anything like that. So that kind of identity, so like kind of a position in society or labeling yourself, this is very like a given nowadays. And that is to show like how we feel insecure without that identity, right? Again, identity itself is, we named it, and it's man-made. And nature itself doesn't have any identity. Nature is nature, right? Like we label nature, that's kind of ridiculous, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But that is what we are doing to ourselves. And we give an artificial identity, and we strongly believe in it. Hence, we are in a world which never ends the conflicts between these different identities, right? The belief in the identities became too strong, so that we have something like we call identity politics as well. So it's just like how far you want to take this to, you know.
And it's not based on any truth, like you said. It's something that you were given. It's not like a fundamental truth. The fundamental truth is nature, and we give a conceptual framework to the way that we see the world. We build a worldview, and all of these are a construction in our mind. They're not the reality as it is. And what the sages and the yogis and the sadhus and all of the great masters wanted to understand and come back in contact with was just that pure nature of themselves, that the Hundun nature, fill the holes in, no more drilled holes in the face, and like this, right? So, and because, as you mentioned, that the world is built on identity now, we're building even more very subtle identities and nuanced identities, and we're identifying with it, and it's all a survival strategy. And as you said beautifully, it's a sign of insecurity because you don't know how to stand on your own 2 feet and not use any sort of association to prop yourself up, to make yourself, to make people, to play the victim and everything like this, right? We're constantly using like religion, gender, race, you name it, right? Nations, nationalistic divisions and stuff like that to prop our own identity up, to play the victim. It's an evolutionary strategy. Where the spiritual path, and especially the path of the great sages, is that you need to get rid of that, because that's actually what's causing all of the problems in the world. Because you're associating to identities like you associate to football teams, and you are behaving like, like the hooligans in the UK who support the Premier League, right? Like, so you're behaving like those people, the violent ones I'm talking about here, and then you have a position that you violently defend. And this is why a lot of the great texts came about, because the great sages in that could realize that, hold the phone here, you guys are just like constantly defending your position and your belief systems and these things that you associate with your identity, and that's what causes actually the conflict. You think that there's actually this abstract conflict out there that you've created, that you and someone else are in conflict with. But that abstract creation is the result of misidentification. And so people don't want to talk about this. I mean, if you and I were to talk about this, say if we went to America and we spoke about this, you and I get thrown off a building, you know what I mean? Because it would be too confrontational to dive that deep. It's like when, for example, as you know, I've done a lot of interviews and that in America and lectured over there. And especially when I speak about what we're talking about, and especially when I speak about Taoism, and say Zen, getting back to your original face and getting rid of all of those concepts and that conceptual framework, people there's a bit of a cringe because it's uncomfortable, because especially a place like America is built so much on the identification with nation and all of these other subtle forms beneath that, and not just to pinpoint America. I mean, a lot of nations are like that too, but America it's a big place for identity politics, as we know. So.
Yeah, it's most visible place, I think.
Exactly.
It exists everywhere, and each individuals have the subtle level of identification thing going on. But I think America is a much more visible and much more outstanding than other places, I think. And again, like you said, that they feel a little bit cringe, and I think they feel somewhat offended as well.
Well, that's probably the better word, offended, not cringe. Like, I'm saying they cringe like this because they are offended and they feel uncomfortable.
Yes, that's right. They are uncomfortable. Yes, and the reason why they feel that way is because they feel like their identity is being attacked. Right? That identity they believe in is so strong, the belief is so strong, so that when you do say things like that, and people get really like threatened or offended for some reason. And again, I think the very reason why the human beings like to have an identity and create this new type of identity to somewhat protect themselves is because also we try to find the reason or purpose of each individual's existence, I think. We try to be relevant, right? We want to be relevant to the world. We want to be this, influential individual to other people. You want to become important, right? And in order to have that, you need to establish yourself in some way, like labeling yourself, and like make your position strong and this kind of stuff. So that there's that, again, that goes back to the insecurity thing. but people want to find a reason behind their own existence. And trying to find the reason that itself is sounded a little bit funny, right? But the way to go about it is very analytical and very intellectual, and it's too artificial. It's not natural.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why, like, you know, what we're talking about today is like one of the things that when you get away from all of this circus that goes on in society, this identity politics and identifying yourself with certain groups and so forth, is that when you go back to nature and say you go on a retreat like we went on our own personal private retreat, is that those identities don't serve you no more. And so there's a feeling of like there is a discomfort there. You know what I mean? Like even all of the spiritual work you and I have done, even when we leave society, there is a bit of a lag period for, maybe for us it might only be 24 hours or so, but for other people it might be a week that they take to kind of get out of this associated habit of like identifying with certain things about themselves in air quotes. There's not really a them there. It's a construct, and that also goes to, you know, their habit of being busy and this and that, which is usually driven by their identity, because they're busy because they are trying to, like you said, make their identity somewhat popular or attractive to the society itself, because we live in a world now, unfortunately, that is built on an attention economy. So the more eyeballs that you can attract, the more money and fame and blah, blah, blah you're going to have. You know, back, let's say, you know, 100 years ago, that was not so much the case, you know. So like, for example, if I existed 100 years ago, I could still be an author and write books, but not many people know me now either too, but it wouldn't be in a way that we could speak here on YouTube and do the podcast, right? Like only those who would read the books would read the books. It was based more on those who were very interested in knowledge as opposed to gaining attention and getting eyeballs on you, right? So, and that's what we see on YouTube, right? Like people will make clever videos and so forth and so on to attract attention. And you can't say that there's anything wrong with that to a certain degree, because that's a function of capitalism, and you can't knock anyone for trying to make a living in their life. So there's nothing much you can do about it, but it should be spoken about, because it turns everything into a commodity then, right? Like you turn philosophy into a commodity, you turn all of these things into a commodity. And we're all probably guilty of that, but there's no way around it in this kind of structure in society, right? So like my original point is that like all of this hyper yang dependency is built in some sense upon this identity that you're trying to promote and prop up, and you know, and if you're a deep thinker, you understand that, and you can see actually things that you are doing that are probably against your nature, against your hundun nature, right? Yeah. And you're drilling these holes in your face to somewhat make yourself appealing to the world, and also to, in some sense, like we were talking about, gravitate towards certain groups and all of these group identifications, you know, to build this identity. So, what were we going to say, love?
No, just again, yeah, we are talking about the world that we live in right now, the very highly yang dependent, not and also yin deficient.
Yin deficient.
Yin deficient. And in a world where if you wanted to have some quiet time for yourself and in a lengthy period of time, and most people don't see the value of it, right? And so forth and so on. And that obviously very strongly related to the culture that we kind of built around us. It's sometimes like, because human being is a cultural animal, and culture originated and it began from the human beings. Yeah. From our own existence, that's how the culture came about. But now it seems like the other way around. Culture consumes us, like, so that we get driven by the culture. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Culture has its own organism, it seems like. But that itself is functioned by our input, obviously. We like certain videos on YouTube. We dislike certain videos. That creates a new kind of rhythm in an algorithm, in the thing, right? And it's a self-generating thing from our input, which one we like, which one we don't like, what kind of comment you put on, things like that.
Yeah, of course.
But in a sense, the whole setup itself is like driving, that culture is driving us instead of we driving the culture.
100%.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know.
So that in a sense, there is some sort of like a cultural monopoly is happening that is quite obvious. And that's another whole topic. But it seems like that we kind of, we lost control of selection of culture that we want to consume. And that is also another big factor, the reason why we kind of misidentifying ourselves and we keep creating these conflicts that's not unnecessary.
Yeah. And let's be frank, the culture that's coming through the internet and through the media in general is American culture, right? Like that's being spread all the way around the world. Let's be frank about it, right? That's what's happening, right? So like, I mean, we will talk about this in another podcast, but that's the culture that's being spread. And invariably, a lot of that culture is based on pop culture. And so then that drives other people in other parts of the world that have no connection to places such as America or the UK or places like that they start to behave like them. And it's actually out of sync with kind of their cognitive style. You have to talk about cognitive science here. There's a lot of things you have to talk about, right? And that creates kind of a strange culture, like what we have in Korea, right? Like where Korea kind of took on American culture, and then you have this really weird pop culture in Korea, which is very strange. And so, in saying that, like you said, it's kind of like a cultural monopoly that's been superimposed on people, unassumingly, for some people. But if you got your eyes open, you can you notice what's happening. But that's different to say, for example, if we look at Hinduism, right? If we look at Hinduism, because it is a culture, that's something that's kind of just grown as a natural byproduct of that environment and so forth. And so that's completely different. It's not, even though on a spiritual level, there will have to be Hindus that are on the spiritual path that will have to get rid of certain things. There's no denying that if you're on a sincere spiritual path. But the culture itself is a product of an environment, a time, and it's also part of the cognitive style of that particular part of the world.
The culture itself is original to the land.
To the land, yeah. And you get that, and those cultures are what we would call, the ascetic cultures of the world, right? Like, so if you go to the Middle East, if you look at the Taoist cultures in China, if you can find any. And, like Buddhism all through Southeast Asia and so forth, the shamanic cultures of South America, Central America. And so, that is kind of like, the beautiful side of culture, but they are, in some sense, like you said, original to the land, but the culture we're developing in pop culture is based, again, on the idea that nothing is sacred. So everything is a commodity. And that's what becomes the culture. So then everything is for sale. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of online and social media and that has become, where everything is for sale. And you can't blame anyone for that per se, because if you don't have enough access to knowledge and your eyes aren't open, you'll just fall into this category as well. And so that's why, in some sense, especially Lao-tzu left society, because he also understood that everything was for sale. Nothing was sacred anymore in that particular part of the world. Not to mention, obviously Confucian morality and what that does to people on a deep level. in creating, as supposedly creating sincere people, but we're creating inauthentic people.
So then my question would be, is there right culture? Is there a good culture and a bad culture? Such thing as bad and good and bad culture. Is there such thing?
It's a difficult question, isn't it? Because then you're splitting hairs, you're getting into right and wrong, and at a deeper level, there's no such thing as right or wrong. There's just the way, you could say, like you said, we are a cultural animal. Culture was a big part of our evolution. And when we talk about culture, we have to be specific here. We're talking about language and religion, art. It's not just what you see, like if you go to India and women are dressed in saris and stuff like that. It's a lot more to what a culture is, right? So I think culture, I think it's difficult. I mean, I think that we have to look at it, from our perspective, in a contemporary perspective, because, maybe someone in 200 years' time now may have a better perspective than what we have, because we may have come out of this nonsense. But if you look at it from this perspective now, I guess that what you would say between like a right culture would be a culture that evolved in a certain location, that gave language, gave religion, art, and sort of defines the people, right? So if we look at mythology itself, mythology is the subjective truth of a certain people, and so people they create their own mythological structure, so to speak, which is a culture. And so we see that all around the world, right? Like where everyone has their own sort of subjective truth, so to speak, through their culture. Yeah. So, but then if we look at pop culture, if we look at the way the world is now, and we look at how everything's for sale, and the worship of money and fame and and attention, then I think that something deep within us says there's something not genuine about that, right? Like we all feel it. I mean, we must be honest, right? Even those people who are okay with selling their soul to gain the fame and the fortune and this and that, they still feel that they're probably not, look, when they get their millions of dollars, they probably forget for a temporary moment, but then they would know that, this is not really in line with their creative juices, so to speak, and what's genuine. We don't even want to speak about right or wrong. We want to speak about what's genuine, right? Like, so from the Eastern spiritual perspective, especially from Taoism and Zen, is you have to talk about what's genuine and what's authentic. And so when we see pop culture, we see a bunch of nonsense where you see a lot of people copycats, and you see people copying the way people speak, and it lacks originality. And so I think that when you start to see that there's a lack of originality in say a culture that spreads across the world, then you could say that it's kind of inauthentic. And I know I'm splitting hairs there, but like for example, like if you go to Southeast Asia, if you go to Thailand, like the culture is Buddhism, right? Like you can't talk about Thai culture without talking about Buddhism, and you see that philosophy in the hearts of the people, because they're very humble, they're very
soft and gentle,
very soft and gentle. Yeah, that's just a part of them. But then when you throw some new culture into the mix, then you start to see Thai people acting in strange ways, and you see a lot of people going, they're doing the opposite. Have a look at this guy, like, you know what I mean? Like, but there's a reason why they're doing that, because in some sense it's disingenuous. It's not authentic. It's based, again, on, like you said, a monopoly on culture that's coming from somewhere else, and you're taking it on board and doing it. And I can tell you, like if we're talking about pop culture, like I said, we're talking about North America and Europe. People in America and that aren't taking on Bangladeshi culture and stuff like that, So we have to think rationally about it. Like, what's happening is a result of the internet, is a result of people who have more access to the internet and are from wealthier countries that are being promoted, well, not being promoted, but just the result of the internet, that are being seen in poorer places in the world, and people are, are thinking in that, start to think in that way, even though it conflicts with their cognitive style. So I think there's a lot of things we have to talk about. We'll talk about that in the podcast that we talk about in cultural monopoly. But I think once we see it conflict with the particular cognitive style of the location, that's when you start to think like that something's not right here, right? Like I mentioned with Korean pop culture, right? Like something's quite off, like with that.
For example, Far Eastern Asian people's cognitive style and, like you said, cognitive style and also the biological imprints are different to the Westerners, for example. Again, like genes are different. That's why I look different than you do. You have big eyes, a massive nose, and all that. I don't have those. Instead of I have big face. And
I look like a horse. I mean, look, you're a beauty and the beast, isn't it?
Just a square face.
I walked into the bar and the bartender said, "Why the long face?" You know what I mean?
So the biological imprint is completely different. So that that certain biological imprint is designed to suit certain culture, certain original culture. But again, like you said, you kind of they imported everything. Like all these countries, they imported like hip hop culture and all the the music or Hollywood and all this type of thing, and that's why you feel something not right about it when you look at it, and like it just you go like it just don't feel right, you know, when you visit those countries, and especially the big cities like Seoul, Tokyo, and Shanghai, and places like that. And I think there's a slight difference in cultures. Like when we talk about, like you said, the original culture, authentic culture, it's something that harmonizes people. And culture is there for us to harmonize the group, like us as a group or society or tribe, whatever, right? But then when there is a culture that's been created for some specific reason, that starts to create the disharmony amongst us.
Yeah, for sure.
Again, as we all know that culture can bring some political problems and some economical diversity to benefit certain people, right? They create these cultures so that, like, for example, when we see television, they promote certain insurance company and banking system and this and that, people will go for it, right? And that becomes part of the culture somewhat, right? And that is to benefit certain people, not most of the public, but for certain people, right? So because of those certain people, they want to use culture to make it advantageous for themselves. Yeah, for sure. There is that kind of culture, so that a job is for us to distinguish between those things, what's beneficial and what's not beneficial for each individual, I think. Yes. And again, line is blurry, as you said, and it is blurry, but we need to develop eyes to see it, really.
Well, this is a key distinction between like original cultures and an artificial culture. And I was going to talk about this in the podcast we'll do, but I'll mention it briefly here. Is that with original cultures, they come from the area, right? They come from what works in that area, what naturally evolved in that area. So the tools that were evolved there, the farming methods, the language, the spirituality, so forth. Now with pop culture and with internet culture, where is it driven from? Silicon Valley. It's driven by a small part of the world that have a particular political ideology and that have a particular way of the world that they feel is best for everyone else. Now, who made them the ones who judge what is best for someone in Chad or, the Congo or Sri Lanka? Who made them in Northern California the ones who judge? That's the difference. See, they are the ones driving the culture. They're driving the culture through the social media platforms. and through what's acceptable. That's why you see, if it's not acceptable to them, they will deplatform someone, which actually blocks freedom of speech, which goes against everything that they should be for as being a democracy. But they have their own particular agenda. No, I mean, people do speak about it, but it doesn't get exposed. And it's a deeper problem, because this is, you are looking at a particular group of people, wealthy people, who think they know what's best for someone, like I said, in Sri Lanka, who's a fisherman. And when he's waiting for his fish, he's on his iPhone, and he's watching something that from somewhere else that's affecting him maybe at a deeper level, but has nothing really to do with his immediate life.
Yeah.
And so this goes back to why we actually should leave the society. You know what I mean? Because you are being manipulated and influenced left, right, and center, and a lot of it's beneath your consciousness. It's beneath your awareness of what's going on. They're attacking you somewhat consciously and subconsciously, and they're just like a puppet moving the strings, and you are moving around to their tune.
I think that's why it's very dangerous, actually.
Very dangerous. Yeah, very dangerous.
Yeah, again, like what Terence McKenna said,
Culture.
culture is not your friend. He really emphasized
Yeah,
it.
he really emphasized it, because it isn't. Especially if on a spiritual level, it's not your friend. Even like I said, even with original cultures, like, I mean, I know Terence was talking about pop culture, but even with original cultures, there are certain things that you have to get over on a spiritual level, because you have to get back to that Hundun state. You know, the faceless, empty void that you would say, you know, in Hinduism they call Brahman, like, would be the absolute reality, which is not a differentiated consciousness, it's undifferentiated. So, so to stick to sort of what we've been talking about, is it's like like what Terence said, culture is not your friend. So that you need to find methods and strategies and lifestyles that can counter this, you know, so-called friendship you have with culture, pop culture we're talking about here, and society in general, and making a distance from it. So, and as we've been talking about, leaving society, becoming a recluse, and this and that, even though it's taboo to talk about, actually there are a lot of benefits in it, because of exactly what we've all been talking about. When you do, as we know, because you and I, even though we went on a private retreat recently, you and I have spent a lot of time away from society in the last 13 years. And a lot of people probably don't know that, because they just watch the channel and they think that you and I have been doing this since forever and a day, but it hasn't been the case. You know, we've spent sometimes 6 months away from the internet and away from society in general, and places in India and Nepal and you know, other places in Asia, and Shanti. And the world goes on. The world goes on, right? And so a lot of people feel that if they don't keep up with what's happening, they're going to get left behind. It's like, you don't get left behind. You actually are leaving them behind. Because you're diving deeper into your own consciousness.
That's so true.
It's so true,
That
isn't it?
is so true. Yeah, I mean, like, when you get to talk to some, I mean, different individuals and this and that, while you've been away from that, what's going on, current situation, right? Then, like, it kind of two completely different world.
100%.
And, like, you kind of think, like, oh, meanwhile, I've read so many books and been contemplate on different things and got interested in different ideas and, like, you know, entertaining different thoughts and this and that, and you know, enjoy time in nature and whatnot. Oh, damn, these guys are still talking about, you know, like, I don't know, like something news on the radio and like, oh,
Current affairs.
yeah, current affairs.
Oh, my
and
God.
like, just dramas. Yeah, another thing. This new season of this TV show beginning this week, and like, you're going, oh, wow, okay, like, welcome back.
Yeah, I mean, how many TV shows can you watch, really?
Yeah.
Like, oh my God.
It's just, and that is, it's so sad to see that is their excitement.
Yeah.
Isn't it sad? Like,
But that's what the machine or the society provides you. look, you've been good, you've done well, so we'll give you another season of Game of Thrones. Here you go.
Yeah.
An extra season for free.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Extra season.
You know what I mean? And then you get in this habit of, like, you become someone who works and then someone who just consumes entertainment. And then you're in this kind of this bind and in this rut and you can't get out of it. But you can't say anything, right? Like, we can say something here because most of the audience here are probably on the same page. I'm sure there's some trolls there that are probably already quick on the thing and emotional and you know, they'll have to have a look, their own introspection. But like, you don't have to keep up with everything. You know what I mean? I remember, like, there was a couple of times you and I had been living away from society and we would catch up with friends and what have you been doing? And I just read a few books and stuff like that. And they're just like, you know, how?
How do you do it?
How? And it's like, well, I'm not like on the grind. I'm not, you know, I'm not chasing a particular thing and I don't need to watch television. People probably know this from the podcast. You and I live very simple. We don't have television and so forth. So, and haven't had well since we've been together. And so, you know, you got to understand in your own mind that if you do get out of the society, that it's actually very beneficial for you. I mean, you don't have to do forever, but getting away, like, you know, I talk about fasting the mind, like these temporary mind fasts where you get away. But if you have the opportunity to get away, there's also a lot of benefits. We don't want to, again, get into this habit of defending society and that you need to take part. You don't need to take part. It's like what Richard Wilhelm said in his commentary on the I Ching. Like, a lot of people will criticize the Taoist sage, but then he says that even though the Taoist sage is separate from society, he's living up on the mountain, he's actually creating incomparable human values for the future without the people even knowing it, because they think they're doing something, but all they're doing is providing the maintenance of the society. The sage is up there creating the future of the world, so to speak, from not being so engaged in the world. And that's why we still have the great books and the great texts, especially of Eastern thought. They weren't created on the grind, you know what I mean? They weren't created on the grind and go-getters. They weren't self-help books. They're not. Eastern spirituality and philosophy isn't self-help. No. You know what I mean? It's not self-improvement. It's the dissolution of the self.
Exactly. Another thing I kind of come to a bit of a realization was that, like, people that I get to have a conversation with know that we don't have a television at home, right? But then you get to talk about certain topics of, let's say, just like what happened to JFK, for example, or certain documentaries that's really interesting and that trigger some thoughts and things like that. We would talk about it, but then people would ask me, how do you know all this? Or how do you watch all these things? If you don't have TV, how do you get to know these things? And then I kind of realized that when you are always exposed to this TV, radio, or smartphone, the social media on the smartphone all the time, is that you kind of become, unwillingly, you become like a passive receiver of this unloading information and unloading unhealthy culture, I think. Yeah. You're not voluntarily selecting what's beneficial to you. No. You become passive, like a sponge. You're just kind of absorbing everything, what they need to tell you. Instead of you are going out there choosing what's beneficial for yourself, for example. And there's a huge difference, right?
100%.
And you become a passive receiver is like a dissolution of the self, basically, right? Like, you don't know what you are really interested in particularly, right? Like, you don't know yourself very well, like what you get to really interested in, right? Because you just, whatever it's shown to you is interesting to you, right?
Yeah.
But if you are more like a contemplative person, and if you have specific interests that's really entertaining your thoughts, then you will go after it, and then you will search in internet to find out more about it.
Yeah,
to
what's for you?
to resolve that your curiosity or questions that you have. So it's there for us to always use, but how you go about makes a huge difference.
Actually, it's the people who are constantly engaged in current affairs, who are on the social media feeds all the time. That's actually the narrow view. That's the narrow view, because there can only be one view with that view. So there's only one view given to you. Your way of interpreting it is different. Whereas you and I, for example, or many people watching and listening, is that when you go out and whatever you are truly interested in, you begin to then broaden your scope, right? Like a lot of people ask me, how do you come across all of these books and this and that? It's because I'm looking for this content. I'm not out there being force-fed the books to read. I don't read pop books. I read those in the past and I don't get anything out of them. Those self-help books, it's just a bunch of nonsense. So I'm out there looking for the work on Zhuangzi, for example, or the Patanjali. I'm looking for, and not just books that you'll find at the bookshop. I'm looking for scholarly books that actually dive deeper into the content, which then enriches my understanding, which then helps people who are watching this channel, because then I can start to articulate it for them. I can't do that if I'm looking through the narrow lens of television and social media and this and that, because my mind will be riddled full of absolute garbage. Like you said, what's on television, or who's in conflict with each other, and this is all detrimental to your spiritual progress. And this is why you leave society. This is, you know what I mean? Because it doesn't do anything for you.
That's right.
And as we noticed, especially in the retreat that we went on recently, is that as soon as you give yourself that space and you just stop, you put an exclamation mark, boom, it's done. And then, like, we were sitting there on the balcony in the cottage that we go to, in the bush, and it's like, there's not much to do, is there? Really, like it. We just sat there sipping our chai and
just like right now.
Like right now, yeah.
And talk about same thing.
Let's talk about the same thing. You know what I mean? And there's nothing to do. There's no, like, I don't have to upload a video. I don't have to, converse with a publisher. You don't have to go to work. You don't have to, have this obligation with your violin. It's just like, boom, it's a stop. And it's like, I remember back in 2010 when at a satsang, when Muji said, when you go through that process of the exclamation point, it's like a fan. So when you turn the fan off, an overhead fan, there's still a little bit of juice left in the fan, and that's what happens. And the problem is that when people go, say, and they go on retreat, and we know this through Vipassana retreats, that a lot of people will go on Vipassana, and after day 1 or day 2, they're gone. They leave because, and it's their option, but the fan still has the juice in it, and it depends on how, tightly wound up you are. Because if you've been a really hectic,
how fast the fan was running.
Yeah, exactly.
It was connected.
If you were on Wall Street, for example, that thing's
like
it may take 6 days for that to completely stop. So, and again, it's not their fault. It's just the way that they live their life. And so we're all the same. If you were on Wall Street or I was on Wall Street, our fan would still be going as well. But because we don't live like that, our fan slowed down fairly quick.
Yeah.
But that's what people have to contest with. When you go on these retreats, a lot of people say, I just can't do it. And it's like, no, it's not that you just can't do it. You just got to ease into it. You got to just be patient. I remember there was that time years ago, we probably spoke about this on the podcast before, we hadn't been to Tiruvannamalai for years, and we were coming from Thailand, and we had a pretty good life in Thailand. We lived in a nice cottage and stuff like that. And things were shanti, things are good. But we threw a spanner in the works, and we moved back to Tiru, and we kind of were a bit like, there was a bit of agitation there at the beginning, and we felt like something's not right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so then we got a taxi all the way to Pondicherry because we thought, maybe Pondi will, we'll get something at Pondi. And then once we got to Pondi, we're like, everything was good at Tiru. So your mind kind of goes through sometimes this crazy process where the fan's still going and you're confused because you've put the exclamation mark and there's a full stop but you're in this process of, but I was doing this and doing that and, everything's going good and I got to keep the momentum going. It's like, you can pick that up any day. You have a bit of a rest. You can pick that up any time you want. You don't have to always stay on the grind. It's not a competition. It's not a running race.
That's just like when we practice meditation as well, isn't it? Like when we sit down and practice meditation. I mean, some days are fine. That fan stops pretty quick. Some days it doesn't, right? No. Then should I sit a bit longer or what? I can't really focus and I can't get it right for this long, and is it gonna ever stop or what? It's a little bit like that, but like you said, you just got to be very patient, isn't it? You just got to be just resilient at those moments that there's a friction between what's going on inside and what's outside, and that's the friction that's happening. And in that moment, if you're a little bit more resilient, and you're gonna get through those moments, and you will be fine. You'll get to that state of mind that you were really searching for.
Some of the most fruitful meditations are the ones where you grapple for a long time, because in some sense, you hear a lot of masters talk about this. You build almost like a meditative strength because you can be that patient. You can be that patient. Again, you are still witnessing your mind. So it's still a form of meditation. You are still witnessing it to the extent that you say, when's this going to turn off? So you're still aware of what's going on internally. So it's still a form of meditation. It's just not a tranquil form of meditation.
Okay. You got to be resilient in the moment that, who's going to win here?
Exactly. And some days, we all know this, that some days are easier to get into deeper states of meditation than others, And that always depends on sometimes circumstances and things you're doing in your life. Maybe you had a big bowl of pasta the night before and that's affecting your psychosomatic organism, or, all sorts of things that you have to take. You had a bad night's sleep. There's a lot of things that happen. Or you got a business meeting at 12 that you can't stop thinking about. There's a lot of things, right? But the skill is you just have to sit and see what happens, so to speak, And in some sense, I always talk about bodhicitta, is just the effort and the effort for meditation and spiritual practice is what's important. You don't, for example, if you are a runner and you have a business meeting at 12, but you run every day, you don't really debate. You're running and your mind's going crazy. You don't go, I wish this mind would turn off. You're still running. And so, but I know meditation is somewhat different, but it's still an activity, so to speak, in that kind of spectrum of daily life. So, but we always want the best meditative states.
Of course.
But in saying that, you can't always have that, and that's the point of meditation. And you understand your mind a lot better, and you understand the activity of your mind a lot better, and actually what affects your mind in those certain ways too. So if you do at a business meeting, you're kind of mindful of that's why the mind is busy. Or if you had a bad night's sleep, that's why. Or you're on your smartphone till bloody 11 at night, and you can't stop thinking about that tweet you couldn't get away and all this sort of nonsense, you know what I mean? And so the thing is that, as you know through meditation, and this applies to leaving society and becoming a hermit, is if you're just patient, the real boon is coming, And so that's, again, as you were talking about before, because we live in this sort of yin-deficient world, we have to constantly cultivate and come back in harmony with these this type of yin mentality. Now, when I'm saying yin here, and we're referring to the kind of the feminine, the soft, but what we're really meaning is the non-doing aspect, the kind of full stop exclamation point of life, and just allowing life to happen, like in a true Taoist context of wu-wei, right? Like just non-doing, allowing life to happen, and not interfering with life. That's really what you're doing when you leave society. You're practicing what the sages practice. And a lot of people, Hans Georg talks about this, like you have to even think about that from a literal sense, about practicing what the sages practice. When we talk about wu-wei, not just about being, in some sense, non-interfering in life itself, but actually removing yourself. Sometimes people will do it permanently or temporarily, and really practicing like what Lao-tzu did. Like he got the hell out,
Complete non-action outside and in and inside.
Exactly.
I think more importantly, the within
is most important, of course.
Important. You can be doing some like a simple housework or just sweeping the outside or the yard or something like that. But if you are to be completely quiet within, that's the state that we want to be at.
Yeah, you want to harness that art of simplicity. Simplicity is the true art of, especially things like the hermit sort of tradition in Taoism and Zen, is the simplicity is kind of the crux. And like once you come back into that simplicity, you begin to understand that equanimous mind that we actually don't know. And see, this is a problem, especially with people in modern day spirituality, because they practice spirituality in city life and in a busy world, that they feel that they've come in contact with this equanimous mind. They haven't. You only come really into contact with that when you actually, in some sense, turn everything off. And this is why we have Buddhist monks and yogis and Taoist sages and that, because they understand that equanimity in some sense, and we're all the same because we all have the same mind, that equanimity can't be harnessed unless we turn and we turn our back on distractions, and like what they say in Vedanta is to turn away from samsara. You're turning away from samsara, making a conscious effort, a choice, like what you were talking about before. And that's what harnesses this. This is what how you gain this equanimous mind. And so, like I was going to read a little bit about what Cold Mountain said. Like for those who don't know, Cold Mountain, Han Shan was a Zen Taoist sage, and he was always talking about this simplicity. And there's things actually in Cold Mountain where he's sitting there like this and watching the world, and he's like, do you think anyone will understand my way of being? Like that simplicity, like he's content watching the birds do their thing, or for us listening to the cicadas blow our eardrums out when we're on retreat, right? So like people don't understand that because you're in this society, that's constantly blah, 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 there's a lot of noise, and then you're in this habit of I got to do this tomorrow, I have this appointment and this and that. But when you put an exclamation point on your full stop on your life, then you start to come into contact with this equanimity that the great sages talked about. And sometimes it's hard to walk away from that, to go back into society and do your thing. Yeah. So I'll read a little bit like what Han Shan said. Han Shan said, "In my first 30 years of life, I travelled hundreds of thousands of miles, along rivers where the great rushes swayed, to the cities where the red dust swirled. I brewed elixirs in a vain search for immortality. I've read the classics and written odes, and now I've returned to Cold Mountain to lie in the stream and wash out my ears." So the dust here, what he's talking about, is just all of the noise and the in some sense, the psychological pollution of society. How our minds get infected and influenced, like we were talking about pop culture before. And so this is kind of like metaphorical of Han Shan returning to Cold Mountain and washing all of the nonsense out. He's back out on the mountain, right? And then another part I wrote, just to highlight this, is he said, "The world is full of busy people, well versed in countless views, blind to their true natures, they've got farther from the way, from the Tao. Countless in worldly views. Aren't we what? Huh? Have a look at the world now. People just have way too many opinions, and as Han Chan says, you become blind to your true nature. And so that true nature is like what we were talking about, that equanimity that you can't really give a name at when your mind begins to fully settle, and and you can't give that a name. So that's the importance of getting away from society and getting back to simplicity, not having anything to do, not being anxious to do anything. And once you begin to down-regulate that anxiety and that stress, you start to really live again.
Yeah.
Your mind is not agitated, and even on a subtle level, it's not agitated.
Yes. Like you mentioned before, like a lot of us are living in a busy environment in the city or at work, or it's hard to escape nowadays. And you would still put some effort for your spiritual growth and equanimity and whatnot. And also you kind of convince yourself that you are somewhat peaceful, or you are growing spiritually in this and that. But I don't think you will come to complete realization until you get to like pure nature surroundings. How much you were so affected by the environment, right?
Yes.
And again, you try so much so that you somewhat achieve some kind of tranquility in society, but in nature, you don't have to give too much of an effort.
No.
It just happens to you, and that is such a great feeling. We both know that, and more you get marinated into that state of mind, how strong your inner self will become, I think. And that's something that you only have to experience for yourself.
Exactly.
Right? That is why it's actually so important to stay away from this busy world as much as possible, or just to keep distance from it, from that noise. That's why it's so important.
Yeah, got to stay away from distraction in general. Like it's all trying to distract your attention, and your attention should be
going within.
Going within should be internalized. Your attention shouldn't be constantly dragged out of yourself. Like what they talk about, like what Patanjali talks about in the Yoga Sutras. Like there's this game of life is always like this external world is trying to like there's this gravitational pull that's trying to pull us out of our existence to engage in things and this and that. But the idea of yoga is, Chitta Vritti Nirodha is to, the cessations of the whirlpool of the mind and turning back within to experience stillness, instead of like having your mind constantly, I'm attracted to that. What did she say about me? Like all of this sort of game that we're in, where it's not even natural to be at that speed. Like it's like fast forward, right? Like we're constantly on fast forward these days, where we can do so many things in a day that even like if we look at 10 years ago, it's extremely fast the way we are thinking and living now, as opposed to 10 years ago, because of social media, because of the free flow of information and the level of distraction out there now.
Is too much.
It's too much. If you wanted to watch every TV show, for example, there's no chance, because there's just way too much content. And let's be frank, 99% of it probably is not needed. It's not even a worthy content. It's just because that platforms have to fill up a certain quota of content that is available for people who are on their platform. So look at YouTube, for example. There's probably, who knows, there's probably over 90% of content on YouTube that's probably not even watched, because there's that many people on YouTube who make videos, but unfortunately they don't get views and this and that. but that's the nature of the platform. It can't be any other way. And there's probably only 10% of people who actually get the views.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so, I mean, I'm just, you know, not, that's obviously not accurate, but it was probably something like that. And so there has to be a really concerted effort by especially people who are really dedicated to understanding themselves and turning away from a lot of this. And like I mentioned, I think in the last podcast, was that, you know, one of the live streams, one individual was kind of defending their social media use, and it was kind of odd, you know what I mean? Like, because that phone is impeding your spiritual progress. You don't see it. And that's why you defend it. You're defending a habit that you've been accustomed to, that you've got accustomed to. But how can something that you're distracted by 24/7 lead to an equanimous mind? It can't. Now, let's be frank, it can't. And a lot of now I know a lot of New Agers will probably say that they're enlightened and this and that, and we all know that it's not true. That they can just sit there and it's not true. Like, we know that, right? Because this, you know, we're mature people speaking here, and so we have to make an effort to distance ourselves from that. It doesn't mean that you don't have to have a smartphone, but do you have to have all of the apps on there? Why don't you just use it for texting and taking phone calls and ringing people? Because there's no real reason actually to be linked up to Instagram 24 hours a day or something like that, right? So this is what becoming a hermit and that will teach you, like that there's an amazing thing. It's like what Jiddu Krishnamurti said in, I think it was Total Freedom. He had a whole section, it was a letter he wrote. He has a whole book on this, I think, about learning from nature. So as nature as an education. And it's just an amazing thing that nature itself has a lot to teach you. But you know how you learn from nature? You just have to observe it. You don't have to analyze it. You just observe it, and you're just there. You're there present with it. And Jiddu was talking about, I think it was one time he was walking down the Ganga with one of his friends, and his description of like the sun rising, and it's very profound, you know what I mean? Like, because it's a pure observation of what was happening for him in sync with that moment. And it's not like anything to analyze. It's just like a description of what happened. Like the sun rose, you know, over the water, and you know, so forth. And so I thought a lot about this when we were on retreat actually recently, because, you know, just being in nature and listening to the cicadas and watching the lizards and so forth, there's just so much you learn when you're just present and you're not distracting your mind with things. And so, and the natural world in some sense is the real world, and that's you coming back in contact with that kind of that real reality of things just happening spontaneously of itself, the Zitran, right, in the Chinese Zitran in Taoism. And so, and we're completely out of sync with that, out of contact with that, because distraction and everything, you know.
Once you give yourself some time to be in nature, then you come to realize that once you allow yourself to be in nature for a certain amount of time, nature got so much to teach you, but you only need to walk into that. You need to allow that to happen. Like you said about that individual defending social media and smartphone and all that. If you don't, there is, unfortunately, there is no chance actually.
No.
So first of all, you need to allow yourself to be in nature and allocate some solid time to spend in nature for that reason, and just purely sit, really, you know, sit in the nature, and let nature to show you what all this is about, really. You know? Like again, when we went for a bushwalk that day, we got to the little like a pond, a stream area, and we got to see lots of interesting water insects and like things that we don't get to see in the city, right? And just purely sitting there looking at it, and wind blows by, and lots of trees there, and waving their leaves, and it's just pure beauty, and that is not something that we can create, because we are nature as well.
Yeah.
The nature is something.
We are that beauty.
Yeah, we are that beauty, exactly. So that we ourselves have an immense responsibility to be able to see it. Like, allow yourself to be in that kind of presence in nature, and just observe it, purely observe it, like just to see for what it is, not try to analyze it or explain it, or just to get that all just behind you.
Yeah.
And just be completely present in nature and see what happens.
Exactly. And I remember when we were sitting at the thing, there's things you notice when you observe that you wouldn't notice if you were on the phone. In nature, for example. Like, we were looking at the shadows of the fish and that on the bottom of the water, and there's just things, there's more subtle things that you can learn and notice. And it's like, it reminds me, because we're talking about this, it reminds me when Terence McKenna was dying, there was a thing that he wrote, and I'm butchering this a little bit, but he saw an ant walking on the ground, and he was just fascinated watching the ant, and he's like, this is what it's all about. Like, it's funny, like, this is what it's all about. And if you're not aware, you miss it. You know what I mean? You miss this beauty. And it's kind of funny, because he's just talking about an ant walking on the ground, but we could say maybe Terence was a bit, because he was dying, he was a bit, romantic or whatnot, but, we know that he wasn't like that. He was always an introspective sort of fella. So, like, that's what it is. And we're missing it. You know what I mean? We're missing that beauty of, like, just an ant walking on the ground, for example. Like,
that's how much we kind of lost in contact with nature.
Yeah.
And what's around us, really.
If we see an ant walking on the ground, we step on it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? We step on it because our phone's over there. I've got to get my phone.
Okay.
Someone tweeted me or whatever. I don't know.
Completely unaware. Completely unaware what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the benefit, isn't it, of all of what we've been talking about. And, if only we all get the opportunity to go back to nature and really look. And like we mentioned at the start of this podcast, you don't have an obligation to society. You don't. You don't have to fantasize about that and think that you do. You don't. That's a Western idea. You know why it's a Western idea? Because it comes from an individualistic perspective that puts humans on a pedestal. Eastern philosophy takes humans off the pedestal and brings them back to earth as no more important than an ant, because you're not. And that's actually what brings real peace and equanimity in the mind, because you then become part of the world instead of above it or something different from it, right? You are nature. And so that's what, especially becoming the hermit, and that will do. That'll help you realize that. And so don't feel like you have an obligation. Don't feel like you need to fulfill society's expectations. If you have an urge to leave society and become a hermit and a sage, obviously do it in an intelligent manner, then go ahead. No one's stopping you, you know what I mean? Or if you enjoy society, but you enjoy to live kind of like a hermit sage in the society, that's also good too. There's no right or wrong.
No. Yeah, there's no right or wrong. You just need to carve your portion out in your life and just to make that as your own space kind of thing, and keep the distance from noise.
Yeah.
And that's very important.
That's the big thing, isn't it? Like, you could still, in some sense, you could still be in the bush, but you could still have your smartphone and being attracted to the noise. You're still bringing the world to you. Yeah. Obviously, if you're in the bush, you probably shouldn't have a smartphone. But that's the big takeaway, is that kind of practice of vairagya, of renunciation of the world and renunciation of things, distractions in general, is what will lead you down that sort of that path. So we hope you guys got a lot out of that today, and yeah, just come back in contact with it. I highly recommend reading something like Cold Mountain, and just dedicate some time, go away on your own private retreat, go to a Buddhist monastery, go to an ashram, find a good mountain or whatnot, and soak in nature, and soak in the equanimity at the root of your mind. That is kind of, in some sense, experienced a lot more when you come back into a real world as opposed to an artificial and distracted world. So thank you for watching and listening, and we'll see you guys next time.